She never thought God still spoke through dreams, not in a world of glass towers and glowing screens, not in a time when logic had replaced prayer and people called miracles coincidences. But that night, the night before everything changed, something reached for her in the dark, a whisper, a vision, a warning that felt more like mercy than fear. Megan Caney saw a city covered in smoke. She saw faces she recognized, terrified, running through gray dust. And above it all, she heard a sound that didn't belong to Earth. Metal twisting. A cry swallowed by silence. Then she woke, gasping for air, her heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest. At first, she thought it was just another nightmare, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It followed her like a presence, not haunting, but holy, something she couldn't explain, yet couldn't ignore. Hours later, she made a decision she couldn't justify. She called her office and said she wouldn't come in. No reason, no excuse, just an unshakable certainty. The next morning, the towers fell, and Megan watched, frozen as her dream came alive before her eyes. Was it instinct? A message from somewhere deep within the soul? Or did the same God who warned Joseph in the night still speak, even now, through visions meant to save, not to terrify? Megan never claimed to be a prophet, but from that day on she could no longer doubt that the unseen is real, that sometimes the voice of Jesus doesn't thunder from the clouds. It whispers softly, in the language of dreams. The morning after the dream, sunlight spilled across Megan's apartment, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like a pause, the space between heartbeats. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, knowing something was wrong but unable to name it. She'd grown up hearing about how God spoke to people in Scripture, through angels, through burning bushes, through dreams. But those were stories for other times, ancient times. God didn't send warnings to women who worked in finance and carried laptops instead of scrolls. At least, that's what she used to think. Yet there it was, the unmistakable pull in her chest. Don't go. It wasn't fear. It wasn't reason. It was something else, a still, small voice, the kind Elijah once heard on the mountain. Not in the earthquake, not in the fire, in the whisper. She poured her coffee, trying to silence the thought. She turned on the radio, the TV, the noise of routine. But everything sounded distant, hollow. Her body was awake, yet her spirit felt suspended, caught between obedience and disbelief. Finally, she made the call. "I'm not coming in today," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, like someone else was speaking through it. The moment she hung up, peace filled the room. Not relief, peace, the kind she hadn't felt in years. It was the peace of surrender, the quiet recognition that she had just listened to something greater than herself. Hours later, that peace was broken by the news. The first plane, the smoke, the confusion. She watched, paralyzed, as the building where she should have been began to crumble. Tears came only after the silence, when she realized she'd been spared by something she couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't explain. In the days that followed, reporters spoke of tragedy, security, politics. But Megan could only think of one thing: the dream, the warning that had felt like mercy. She replayed it in her mind, not to understand, but to remember. Because deep down she knew, if she ever doubted again, that memory would be her proof, proof that the God of Daniel and Joseph had not gone silent, proof that the voice of Jesus still moves through the chaos, not always in miracles, but in moments. Moments where faith and fear collide, and obedience becomes salvation. From that day on, Megan stopped asking why. She began asking what now. What do you do when heaven interrupts your life? When you realize God didn't just save you from something, He saved you for something? That question would follow her for years. It became her prayer, her purpose, and her quiet reminder that sometimes divine protection is only the beginning of the story. In the days that followed, time lost its shape. The city moved through grief like a body learning to breathe again. Sirens became the new rhythm of Manhattan. Candles lined the sidewalks where people whispered names and held pictures of faces the world would never see again. Megan walked among them, silent. Every step felt undeserved. Every prayer sounded like it belonged to someone else. She had been spared, but spared for what? At night, she sat by her window, looking toward the empty space where the towers once stood. Smoke still drifted in the air, thin and endless. She tried to pray, but didn't know how. The only words that came were the simplest. Thank you. Then, after a pause, why me? Sleep no longer came easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same gray sky, the same soundless collapse. But beneath the fear, there was something different now, a quiet awareness, the kind you can't unlearn once you've felt it. She thought about the stories she had heard as a child, Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph warned in a dream, the angels who spoke to shepherds in the night. Back then, they were just stories. Now they felt like evidence, proof that God doesn't speak only to the holy or the strong. Sometimes he speaks to the ordinary, the ones who listen even when they don't understand why. Weeks passed before she returned to work, in a different building under a different skyline. People called her lucky. Some said she must have had good intuition. She smiled politely, but inside she knew the truth was heavier than luck. It wasn't intuition, it was intervention. Still, the guilt followed her. Survivor's guilt, they called it. But to her it wasn't guilt. It was responsibility. A sense that if God had saved her, it wasn't just from something, but for something. She began to write again, not reports or numbers, but fragments of her thoughts. She filled notebooks with verses she remembered half by heart. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Every word felt alive. Every page a reminder that the same Spirit who had once spoken through prophets still moves quietly through the modern world, through the language of dreams, instincts, whispers. And slowly, Megan began to understand. What she'd received wasn't just protection, it was an invitation to trust that God still moves through mystery, that the hand of Jesus still reaches into ordinary lives even when we're too distracted to see it coming. She didn't ask for the dream, she didn't deserve the rescue, but grace rarely waits for permission. Weeks turned into months, but the question never left her. It followed her into her morning walks, her prayers, her quiet moments with coffee. Why did God warn me? Some people would have buried the memory, afraid of the weight of it. Megan couldn't. She began searching, not for explanations, but for understanding. She started reading everything she could find about dreams in Scripture, about prophecy, about the ways God has spoken to people through history. One night she opened her Bible and found herself in the book of Genesis. Joseph stood before Pharaoh, explaining a dream that would save nations from famine. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The words struck her like lightning. Dreams, she realized, were never about spectacle. They were about purpose, about warning, preparation, mercy. She read further. The angel who came to Joseph, husband of Mary, warning him in the night to flee with the child. A message given while the world slept. That story had always felt distant, ancient, but now she saw it differently. The same God who sent that dream had spoken again, quietly, into a small apartment in Manhattan. She began writing down her reflections, not to publish them, but to remember. her journal filled with verses, prayers, questions, fragments of thought that started to sound less like confusion and more like calling. Sometimes she would walk near the memorial site, the space where absence itself became sacred. She would watch people pray, cry, or simply stand in silence, and in that silence she would feel it again, the presence that had once woken her in the night. Not a voice, not a vision, but a peace that seemed to say, "I was there." It wasn't comfort in the usual sense. It was a realization that God had not only protected her, but entrusted her with the memory of that protection. She wasn't supposed to forget. She was supposed to carry it. Slowly, she started sharing her story, first with a pastor, then with a small Bible study group. At first, people didn't know what to say. Some cried, others asked questions she couldn't answer. But every time she told it, the fear lost a little more of its power, and faith took its place. One woman told her, "Maybe the dream wasn't just for you. Maybe it was for everyone who needs to know God still sees us." Megan never claimed to be special, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something timeless, the same God who moved in Scripture still moving in a modern skyline. That realization didn't erase the tragedy or the grief, but it transformed it. Because once you've seen the hand of God in the shadows, you stop asking where He is. You start asking what He wants you to do next. Megan didn't recognize it at first. The calling didn't come with a sound or a sign. It grew slowly, like dawn creeping under a closed door. She had spent months trying to make sense of what happened to her, and somewhere in that search, she stopped wanting answers. What she wanted was direction. If God had gone to the trouble of interrupting her sleep, there had to be a reason. One evening, she attended a small prayer gathering at a friend's church. The room was dim, filled with the soft hum of whispered petitions. People prayed for healing, for peace, for strength to endure. Megan sat in the back, uncertain why she had come. A woman began to speak, her voice quiet but certain. "Some of us were saved for a reason we don't yet see," she said, "and until we understand it, our peace will never settle." The words pierced her. It felt as if they had been waiting for her. That night she wrote a single sentence in her journal. "If God speaks to the waking world through dreams, maybe my life is meant to be an echo of that voice." From then on, she began sharing her story more freely. Not as proof of anything, not even as miracle, but as testimony. A reminder that God still walks through the ordinary, that the same Jesus who calmed storms can still reach into the lives of those who least expect Him. At first, it was small. Church groups, youth meetings, quiet living rooms where people leaned forward, listening. But the reaction was always the same. Tears, questions, and the quiet awe of those who'd once doubted and suddenly weren't so sure. Each time she spoke, Megan emphasized one truth. "I wasn't saved because I was faithful. I was saved because He is." Her message wasn't about fear. It was about listening, learning to trust the holy interruptions that don't make sense until much later. She found comfort in words Jesus once spoke. "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." That became her purpose, helping others hear again. Not through dreams, necessarily, but through awareness, through a heart soft enough to notice when the divine whispers. Years later, people still reached out to her. Some told her of their own warnings, their own impossible coincidences. Others simply said, "Your story made me start praying again." And that, she realized, was the reason she had been spared. God hadn't only saved her from death. He had saved her for a message that faith isn't something buried in the past. It's alive, still speaking, still calling. Megan never dreamed of fame or a platform, but she carried her story like a candle, small, steady, meant to light the way for those still searching for proof that heaven hasn't gone silent. Years passed, but the story never dimmed. It followed Megan like a soft echo, not haunting, but guiding. She built a quiet life again, though never the same as before. Every morning when sunlight hit her window, she remembered that mercy had met her in a dream. She often said that surviving was not the miracle, listening was. God was already speaking, she told a friend once. I just finally stopped to hear him. Her words began to spread, not through fame or television, but through conversation, through people telling people the way faith once moved in the early church. Someone would whisper her story to another, usually beginning with the same sentence. Did you hear about the woman who dreamed of the towers? And always the tone wasn't sensational, it was reverent. Churches began inviting her to speak. Some wanted to hear about prophecy, others about courage. But Megan only spoke about obedience, about how faith is rarely loud. Sometimes, she said, God's voice doesn't thunder. It trembles. She never described her dream in detail again. She said it didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to anyone who needed to believe that heaven still interrupts earth. As she grew older, her certainty deepened, that Jesus doesn't only speak through Scripture, but through the stillness between our thoughts, that when he chooses to warn, it isn't to frighten, but to protect, to remind us that love itself is watching. There were moments when she still woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, half expecting the old vision to return. But now, the fear was gone. In its place was peace, the same peace that had entered her apartment that morning when she obeyed the whisper. Once, during an interview near the end of her life, she was asked what she thought really happened that night. She smiled, slow and sure. I think Jesus still walks where we least expect him, she said. He didn't come to me in a church or in a miracle. He came in a dream, because that was the only way I'd listen. Her voice trembled slightly, then steadied. People think faith is about believing in the unseen, but maybe it's about remembering that the unseen believes in us. When she passed away years later, her journal was found beside her bed. The last line she had written was short, just 5 words. He warned me in love. And that is how her story ends, not with fear, but with faith. Not with mystery unresolved, but with mercy recognized. Because sometimes God doesn't speak to change the world. He speaks to save one life, and through that one life, remind the rest of us that he never stopped speaking at all. Long after Megan was gone, her story kept resurfacing, whispered in sermons, shared in classrooms, repeated around kitchen tables late at night. It was never told the same way twice. Some called it a miracle, others called it intuition. But everyone who heard it felt the same pause, that soft silence after the last word, when the heart stirs and the mind can't quite explain why. People began writing to the church she once attended. Letters came from strangers who dreamed of car crashes and stayed home, from mothers who woke to pray for their children at the exact moment of danger, from men who changed a routine for no reason and survived. None of them knew Megan personally, but each of them understood her story. It was their story, too. Faith has a way of multiplying when it's shared quietly. Her testimony became a seed, not planted in headlines but in hearts, a reminder that miracles don't need to be proven to be real. In time, pastors began quoting her line, "He warned me in love." Simple, untheatrical, but it carried power. It described a God who doesn't just control fate from above, but enters the fragile details of human life. A God who interrupts, not to frighten, but to preserve. Some said that Megan's dream was a sign that prophecy had returned. Others said it was proof of divine intuition, the human soul still tuned to the Creator's frequency. But to those who understood her faith, it wasn't about the dream itself. It was about the response. She listened. That is where her story truly lives, in that split second between doubt and obedience. The moment when she could have dismissed the warning, rolled over and gone back to sleep. The miracle wasn't in the dream. It was in the choice. Her journal, which circulated among believers after her death, ended with a reflection few had ever read aloud. She wrote, "I think heaven doesn't always send miracles. Sometimes it just sends moments. And when you listen, you turn a moment into a miracle." Those words became the closing line in a small documentary about her life, the dream that saved her. It was quiet, reverent, filmed in muted colors. No dramatization, no spectacle, just truth told softly. The final frame of that film lingers on a candle burning against a dark background. Beneath it, her words fade in. He still speaks. We just forget to listen. And that is the echo she left behind. Not an argument, not evidence, but an invitation. To pause, to listen, to remember that God is still near and that, sometimes, the softest voice in the night is the sound of heaven breaking through. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't ask for words, the kind that fills a room after a prayer or after a story that feels too close to your own. That's the quiet Megan left behind. Her life became a question written across time. If God still speaks, are we still listening? Generations later, that question still lingers. It moves through those who have felt warnings they couldn't explain, who've turned down a road for no reason and found safety waiting. It moves through the skeptic who wants to believe but doesn't know how, and through the believer who's forgotten that miracles don't always shout. Because the truth hidden in Megan's dream isn't about terror or survival. It's about attention, about the fragile line between the natural and the divine, and what happens when someone chooses to trust it. In Scripture, the prophets often described God's voice as wind, as fire, as thunder. But Elijah learned the truth on Mount Horeb, that God wasn't in the earthquake or the storm, but in the still small voice. That voice hasn't changed. It just waits for us to grow quiet enough to hear it again. Every generation has its dreamers, those who see beyond reason, who sense danger, who wake with hearts pounding and don't know why. Some call it intuition, some call it warning. But Megan's life reminds us of something gentler, something older. It's not only the mind that can see, the soul sees too. When she chose to stay home that morning, she didn't know she was obeying a divine whisper. But heaven doesn't measure faith by certainty, only by response. And maybe that's the point. God doesn't ask us to understand every sign. He just asks us to listen. The towers that once touched the sky are gone now, their absence a memorial to all that was lost. But somewhere in that skyline, in a story passed from voice to voice, there remains one quiet miracle, a reminder that faith isn't a relic. It's alive, patient, still speaking in the language of dreams. And if you close your eyes long enough, if you breathe and listen, really listen, you might just hear what she heard. Not thunder, not fear, just a whisper, ancient and kind. I am still here.